Good evening, everybody. This is Dr. Long at Colorado Tech. It is live chat for November 8th, 2019. My running buddy Les Kazaz here with us from Calgary, tuning in. So what I want to talk to you about tonight is a practical application of the principles of organizational development and change that we're studying in theory, and then how that actually plays out in the field. And I want to talk a little bit about practical scholarship and professional education along the way. So 3 years ago, I started a collaboration with some faculty in the business school at University of Pittsburgh, and we were looking at the problem of how to teach professional ethics in a hands-on simulation that would prepare students for the real world. And we were doing something similar in military classrooms with the leadership model there, so we created a game together and we branded it for each one of our demographics, and then we did kind of a mutual study and then compared the notes and discovered that the way we were doing it actually had a positive payoff, statistically significant compared to traditional lecture modes, and it was very teachable, and the faculty and students both really loved it. Much more satisfying than traditional lecture, and so it was like a win all the way around. So we've continued our partnership in some other areas as well with case-based learning and other kinds of simulations. Well, the word of our success had traveled around Pitt, and so they flew me and my partner out there in order to talk to a bunch of different interested parties. So my partner went on week one, I went on week two. Flew out on Sunday and then worked all day Monday and half the day on Tuesday. And so I just want to give a summary of what went on and what some of the emergent themes are and how it connects to what we're doing with organizational alignment and strategic planning and the development of professional knowledge. So the people I talk to, usually in about 2-hour settings each one. So my colleague out there arranged for my little traveling road show to go around and visit a bunch of people. So they just kind of set them up, and I went in and did strategic planning and mini lecturing with them in 2-hour sessions. And so I had a chance to meet with 3 different deans of various parts of the business school and talked about the design of professional education, faculty development, integrated team-based teaching, case-based reasoning, and simulation-based learning in the classroom, and then how to build a strong internship program between students, faculty, and partners in the business and public community. I talked with faculty members in the MBA program and in the undergrads program on how to incorporate experiential learning, flipped classroom, hands-on education, and student-centric learning that features the gradual release of responsibility model in which the teacher starts off as a bit of a sage on the stage, but then transitions slowly to a guide on the side, and the students become more responsible for their own education. We have a lot of experience that really works well. Most recently, in our military classroom, we took a 4-lesson series on very technical resource management topics, and by that part of the curriculum, the students had become accustomed to doing their own reading, their own preparation, coming to class with reasonable questions and excellent insights, working in small groups to develop some expertise, and then sharing that expertise with the other small groups that had specialized in a different part of the curriculum. And then having all of that filmed, and then offering student-based questions and answers, recording that, and then analyzing the oral communications, all of which is designed to make them self-sufficient, collaborative learners who take responsibility for their own education and who are competent in analyzing, synthesizing, and then communicating professional information. So we just took a standardized testing on that material, and without me saying a word in the classroom other than to push the button on the camera, our team scored 8 percentage points higher than the college average with a much tighter standard deviation. So we have a lot of evidence that this kind of student-centric learning can be done, measured in weeks and months rather than years, and that it affected quite a wide variety of students and teachers, because my other teaching partner is first year teaching, and so you don't even have to have a lot of classroom experience to do this, and this is why this was attractive to the business school at Pitt. So I talked to their deans and their faculty members and some curriculum designers. Then I talked with about 25 soon to graduate members of their MBA program, talking about how to start making their way in the world through interning and building collaborative teams, and how to get moving in solving real problems in the world with public and private partnerships using an ecosystem approach. And then I talked with 21 undergraduates and went through some experiential learning about integrity, problem solving, and developing expertise in the classroom using a modified Cornell note-taking sheet system that helped them quickly structure information from an expert and then internalize it and then make it their own. What was interesting was that I had handed out a note-taking sheet in that class, and their faculty was amazed to see them actually put down their cell phones, close up their laptops, and start taking manual notes on that note-taking sheet. And she said she'd never seen that before in 5 years of teaching, and it was by far the most engaged her class had been with any instructor in her experience. So it was kind of interesting to see how quickly you can connect with people across the generations, and if you provide them a structured way to receive knowledge, that it really helps with their retention and their motivation. It's the same approach that we use in our classrooms here and in my professional consultation with traders and institutional investors. So faculty, deans, two different sets of MBA students and business students. Then I spent a couple hours with the Reserve Officer Training Corps cadre at University of Pittsburgh, who's also responsible for 13 other colleges and their ROTC programs on a 3-state basis. And they were having problems with too much mission, not enough resources, and running out of time. So I gave them some master classes on how to organize a flipped classroom, to use cameras and train the trainer techniques, and then use that student-centric approach, which we think is going to pay off in dividends as they try to adapt to their teaching environment. So I'll be continuing to work with them at a distance because of my familiarity with military professional education, but we made a lot of money already with that. Then I spent a couple hours with 2 National War College fellows. These are senior colonels in the Army who have just completed their senior education and were selected for their scholarship to study anything they want for 1 year, and they only have to produce a 1,500-word essay and a 5,000-word essay on something they find interesting. And these 2 colonels were working at University of Pittsburgh with the Cyber Center because they were interested in cyber, and what started off as a 15-minute office call became a 2-hour design thinking session organized around, you guessed it, an ecosystem approach to understanding cyber, who the players were, public and private, what the issues are, what the emerging themes and trends were in the world, both in the U.S. and otherwise. And so I had a couple international officers write on this very subject over the last couple years as part of their updating of their national defense plans when they come to our college. And so I was able to connect them with some of these scholars from Kazakhstan, Armenia, and the Czech Republic to show what cyber means to those nations that find themselves between dancing elephants like Russia, EU, NATO, and the United States, while facing incredible immigration pressures on their border and declining economies. So cyber and information operations in those environments provide new insights for these National War College guys. Now, they basically have an unlimited travel and time budget, so I'm going to be connecting them with some other officers this year who are working on exactly those topics at our college. So we're going to try to start building that out into an ecosystem of Army thinkers that crosses a bunch of different colleges. So that has a lot of promise. I then spent a couple hours with the Food 21 program director at University of Pittsburgh, who has a $35 million grant and a couple years to try to figure out how to solve the problem of converting unused and obsolete industrial age infrastructure and real estate in Pittsburgh, and converting that into eco-friendly, sustainable local agriculture that would help solve the problem of food islands in the inner city, while also building out some leadership and mentor programs. And then she had the money and some ideas on the biology side, but she didn't really have an appreciation that you could use an ecosystem approach to solving that problem in the same way that you use an ecosystem approach to solve the technical challenges of growing food. But if you expand that to the socioeconomic and political dimensions of this problem, in the university, she's ideally positioned to create a safe space, an opportunity space for politicians, scholars, civic organizations, community leaders, unserved demographics, business interests that have technical solutions, and create an opportunity space where people can get organized and start solving this problem. For instance, pointed out that she could get a hold of local high schools and junior colleges in their machine shops and figure out how to build modular, urban, annual greenhouse packages that could use green power to raise crops year-round that could then be distributed to community food banks through churches, schools, and whatnot, and then actually start building a generation of kids that have respect for food and hard work and project management and team building, and start trying to counteract some of these forces that divide us. That incorporates, obviously, some leadership and management and design thinking and organizational development and change and transformational leadership in organizations, as well as resource management and some business savvy. So that turned out to be a pretty interesting project that we're going to be collaborating with them on, and I've already connected her with some guys in our college and some other guys of my acquaintance that study bioterrorism, food distribution, community action, and so forth. So we're going to try to build a little community of interest, community of action. And the central idea behind all this was the ecosystem approach, which allows us to not overly concentrate too early on what we think the problem is, but to get a wide view, a wide-ranging assessment of the broad environment to try to figure out who the actors and agents and forces and structures are that are in that neighborhood. Because when you start working with design thinking, you begin with a description of the current state, and then a description of the desired future state. And then you say to yourself, well, why don't I just go there? And the answer is because problems emerge that stop the easy movement. So I'll just go around them. Well, it turns out that more problems emerge, and you start discovering that the operational approach is really tricky. And if you haven't already done your homework to figure out who all the people in the neighborhood are, you could start fixating on the relationship between your proposed operational approach and the problem as it develops, and miss the second and third order effects. But if you have done an inventory of potential stakeholders, you can start enlisting them to help you assess whether or not your operational approach will work for them. So if you start much wider than you think you have to at first, it pays off dividends later as you discover that this complex problem really morphs and expands into other areas. And they not only provide critical thinking, but creative solution finding, and then building a community of interest and action. So the ecosystem approach, which incorporates the best of systems thinking and feedback loops and humble learning and action learning, action research, the rigor of research plus the practical pragmatism of real-world problem solvers, really turns out to be the best way to approach solving complex problems in the real world, and design thinking is one element of that. Another issue that crossed a lot of different boundaries then with all of these groups was the idea of the 5 feedbacks that we talk about in our class and in my consulting, and that is that you ask people that you're working with, what's the best thing, the worst thing, the biggest surprise, the best takeaway, and your biggest question. And then you do more of the things that are working. You try to explain why the things that didn't work what they were designed to do, so maybe there's an alternative way to do it, or it opens up their ideas to different ways of thinking, so nothing is ever wasted unless you fail to learn from it. The best takeaways are things that are immediately useful and directly applicable to the situation at hand. You don't even have to work any harder, you just do it. So we share those around to other people because they have practical payoff immediately. The biggest questions are things that we commit to following up with in writing and to show our commitment to following through. And then finally, the aha moments are the ones in which we had assumptions about what was going to happen next, but it didn't work out that way. And that allows us to go back to our initial assumptions and figure out why we thought the world was one way, but it turned out to be the other way. And you'll discover that this is a source of paradigm shifts quite often. So we're very mindful of what caused that learning moment, that teachable moment, that sudden shock that brings them here and now, in which they become mindful. Because when you're working with adults, a lot of times they're giving you minimum attention because they've learned how to multitask and how to be respectful but without being fully present. And then something gets said or done that really surprises them and snaps them into the moment. And those things become really critical to discovering how our estimate of the situation really was not accurate. It often leads to profound changes in the way we think. The 5 kinds of knowledge turned out to be a pretty resonant idea. And so when I talked with the students of both undergrad and graduate and the faculty, and even the other problem solvers, I said, look, we think about the knowledge of the head, the heart, the gut, the hands, and the feet before we can say we really know something. Knowledge of the head means that you understand the rational underpinnings, the cognitive structure, but by itself it doesn't mean anything unless you have the knowledge of the heart, which says, I've connected this body of knowledge to my purpose in life, my legacy, my mission statement, which gives me the energy and motivation to do what must be done and keep going. The persistence comes from there. The knowledge of the gut is our emotional center that worries about things, is fearful, is risk averse. And we have to have knowledge of the gut, which tells us in our center that this must be persisted with. We got to be resilient. We've got to endure the challenges and fight our way through it, knowing that we're on the path if we will just keep going. So the knowledge of the gut is how to triumph over adversity and friction, even when allies desert you, but how to keep going when times are tough. That's knowledge of the gut. Knowledge of the hands means that not only do we understand it in those other 3 ways, but also we can do things. We can make things that have tangible payoffs that are robust and scalable and actually get the work done. We can make good tools that help other people. But that's not good enough unless you can get it into other people's hands. You need the knowledge of your feet to take that information in your presence and take it to the people who need it. Unless you travel that journey and then journey with them with your feet, you don't get the follow through that makes a long-term change for people. So by integrating all 5 of these kinds of knowledge, head, heart, gut, hands, and feet, only then can we say that we've got knowledge that makes a difference in the world that lasts. I link that up with the 4 ways of learning, and we can see how the different ways of learning allow us to develop each of those 5 kinds of knowledge. The propositional knowledge, which relates to the knowledge of the head, which is formal and theoretical and sage on the stage. And then presentational knowledge, which is that knowledge that we only get by trying to teach it and communicating it, because then we have to see through our students' eyes, and that gives us a second angle to triangulate this new, deeper understanding as we try to put our knowledge, the way we understand it, into new words, and that will often reveal new aspects that we hadn't considered before because we thought we already knew what we knew. And then there is the practical knowledge that comes from hands-on performance that becomes knowledge of the hands by repetition, where you learn how to do things by doing them. And then there is the unconscious knowledge that comes from many repetitions where you're learning at the organism level and you're not even aware of what's going on. It generates the tacit knowledge, which really informs your gut and your intuitions and comes in at a deep level. So you find yourself doing things as an expert without even conscious awareness. It's the how you react in time when the situation changes without even thinking. So those 4 different ways of knowing, of learning, allow us to develop those 5 kinds of knowledge, which ultimately, in most of the things we do, becomes craft knowledge of how to do things and how to say things and how to be one with your material and how to transmit that to others in service of others. And craft knowledge is how you build that in the world of trading, in consulting, in going into a new situation and applying your rules of thumb. We spent some time with the modified SWOT matrix, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and I'm going to cover that next week in a little greater detail because it has some real payoffs. But it allowed us to come up with 4 different strategies where you take your internal assessment of your strengths and weaknesses, and then the external assessments of opportunities in the environment and threats from opponents or the environment. You start matching those variables up, and there's 4 categories of strategies that emerge that demand your attention on how to allocate your limited resources. So 4 very different categories of strategies. So when I think about how to win, I take my strengths and put them on opportunities. That's how I exploit my strengths to get the big win. But sometimes I have to be concerned about my own weaknesses and how threats from the environment can jeopardize my survival before I can win. So the strategies that you come up with to protect your weaknesses from threats are very different from the ones where you exploit opportunities with strengths. But you got to have both of those as part of your palette of choices, your salad bar of strategies. Sometimes you may discover that you have to put your strength against the threat, and so divert your growth opportunity in order to defeat the threat because your weakness is too weak and you can't afford the risk. So you might have to divert some amount of your strength just to defeat their threat. It doesn't promote your own growth, but it does set conditions for survival. So you have to then allocate energy and resources to where you're going to put your strengths. Then finally, you can take a look at your weaknesses versus opportunities. And what that means is, are there low-cost, low-risk ways that I can improve my weakness before the threat gets on me? So maybe I can attend a class or do a checklist or improve an SOP or do a little training. And so if I can find low-cost, low-risk ways to improve my weakness, then in the future I may not have to put a strength on a threat because I've removed that weakness from that threat's reach. And then I can save my strength for those opportunities I want to seize. So when we look at the SWOT matrix, the modified SWOT matrix, we can then start generating these 4 different categories of strategies that allow us to develop a strategic plan that incorporates all of these in some kind of blend that are logically organized and so forth. The final one I want to talk about tonight, which I think is really powerful, was this idea of we called it the 10,000 acorns idea. And so the idea of the 10,000 acorns is this. You think about an oak tree that's 200 years old. It's amazing, and it's powerful and strong, but it's not very fast. It doesn't really move around all that quickly. But it's been able to endure for 200 years, and oak trees are so smart as a species that they figured this out. They actually created acorns and created squirrels to provide a long-term strategy for propagation of the species. This is how clever the oak trees are. You wouldn't know it to look at them, but they get deep knowledge because their roots go deep. So they figured out that the best place to grow a new oak tree was close to, but not underneath, an existing oak tree. If you try to grow it right underneath that oak tree, it blocks the sun, so it doesn't work. But the ground that's near an oak tree is probably pretty good for growing an oak tree because you already got oak trees. So what they figured out was we need a a delivery mechanism. And the reliable one is a squirrel who is hungry for acorns. So we're going to create an acorn that has the internal seeds that are not digestible by the squirrel if he eats it. We're going to surround that with organic material that is tasty and nutritious to the squirrel, so he wants the acorn. But even if he doesn't eat the acorn and crap it out and create the natural fertilizer for the seed to germinate, that organic material itself will support the seed. So it doesn't matter whether the squirrel eats it or not. As long as the squirrel will carry that acorn, which is now a perfect package that's all-weather packaging material and protects the seed, in a nice little portable package that fits inside the squirrel's cheeks, and now he can carry it a squirrel's distance away from the tree, and he packs them away in his little treasure trove of acorns. And then he forgets about it because he's a squirrel. He doesn't have a long attention span. That's not his strength. So he buries those acorns inside a tree, which then dies and decomposes, and now you have all this rich organic material and enough water and sunshine now creates the opportunity for some of those acorns to grow, and some of them will grow into oak trees. So if you produce a box of 10,000 acorns, I will guarantee you that some of them are going to grow into those 200-year oak trees and create generations of millions of acorns and propagate the species. And some of them will only be 150 years old and 100 years and 50 years and 20 years. So you have a variety of return on investments of different oak trees, all of which are producing acorns reliably. Now, if you were a scientist but didn't have a proper understanding of the problem frame in the environment, you might actually take a microscope and start trying to detect differences between the acorns to see if you could predict which acorn was going to be the one that grew into an acorn, because only some of them become oak trees. Most of them just decompose and never germinate. So I want to just pick the right acorns. And so you might spend all your time back testing and studying the differences between acorns. And if you have a powerful enough microscope and you spend enough time and you're very clever, you can find ways to categorize and differentiate between acorns, and then you think that you can predict which acorn is the right one. But here's the truth. All of those acorns have the potential to be an oak tree if they fall into the right environmental conditions, which isn't the acorn's job. The acorn's job is just to be an opportunity at low risk to the oak tree. And so we can produce 10,000 of them. If you distribute them wide enough, mathematically, you're going to get enough oak trees and propagate the species. And they will be robust to the environment, and over time you'll populate the earth with oak trees. So that's how smart oak trees are. So if you're in the business of growing long-term sustainable hardwood forests, which is one of the great long-term investments ever, your job is to generate as many acorns as fast as you can and then distribute them widely. And then if you want to improve on nature, what you can do is study the ones that are actually growing, then do the things to protect their environment against the threats to the early emergent oak trees. And that is keep the bunnies away and the deer and protect the ecosystem, and maybe transplant them to a place where you can cultivate and then manage that trade or manage that opportunity. So if you're in the business of trying to solve complex human problems, you want to be like the oak tree and generate lots of acorns that are small, scalable, robust opportunities that can quickly fail or succeed, and then find the ones that work, and then allocate your other resources into scaling those and then developing the ones into long-term big winners and then cutting the losers short. That's the long-term heuristic towards making real significant changes in the world, and that's why the program is built around action research and iterative learning and case studies and deep knowledge, trial and error, and a respect for the data, and then trying to figure out what actually is the problem frame that we're trying to solve, and then developing management and planning strategies that allow us to become more successful. So remember the idea of the acorns. And the time that I spent in the design thinking at University of Pittsburgh with the food program was to show them how that $35 million should not be spent on the one thing that they thought was the perfect one that was going to win, but to generate an awful lot of small, scalable opportunities quickly. And then the only failure would be to think that they were all going to succeed and then not try to figure out what you could learn from the failures as a science project. So if you could get some young kids in there with some ideas and help them develop a strategy that would work and then invest money in them, even if it fails, and especially if it fails, show them that they had already become winners by having the growth mindset and the entrepreneurial spirit to try things and the courage to put it into practice, and then the technique to learn from it so that they would get better as a consequence of the assessment and the self-development, and then show them that you were going to continue to fund that and until such time as they found the thing that would scale and would win, and then they would build the emotional resilience and the personal confidence and the team building skills that can turn around any difficult human situation and make winners out of the entire community. That's how you win, using the Acorns strategy. So that connected at a very deep level with the people in that room that were doing design thinking on the Food 21 project. So I'm going to stay connected with them and continue to give them some mentoring and advice as they try to build this thing out. Because if we can do it in Pittsburgh, you can do that in any city where there's people trying to transition from industrial age manufacturing to a more enlightened, sustainable, eco-friendly, local agribusiness that blends public and private partnerships and repurposes the land inside cities and allow those things to become fit for human habitation that we can all respect. So let's end these stupid wars and put some of that money where it belongs, showing the way to a brighter future. So that's what we talked about at University of Pittsburgh with every single demographic that I work with. That was the common theme. And when I brought that back to Fort Leavenworth and I started talking to my military officers, I said, learn how to do this design thinking and team building and leadership ethics and outreach to the community, because at some point you're going to retire and you're going to have 30 to 50 years of service life left in you, and there's nothing more powerful than a selfless servant who knows how to get things done, who has ethics and is a good problem solver and knows how to build teams and develop people. And I just see how we can leverage the leadership skills of people that are serving us now for our mutual defense, but turn that into a growth industry for taking care of human problems that reach across demographic boundaries and start tying people together into communities of practice and start living like civilized human beings instead of a bunch of rodents and unenlightened mammals. So let's make the world a better place and figure out with our head and our heart and our gut and our hands and our feet how to get things done. And so I challenge you in our program not just to learn the words and the theories and the concepts with your head, but connect these things to your heart, your mission. Learn how to press through the challenges with your gut. Get to completion on this, because if you can get through this program, you're going to be able to influence tens of thousands of people directly downstream in the rest of your career. And those 10,000 people are going to be like 10,000 acorns that are going to grow millions of oak trees and lead to a sustainable future. That's the compound return on investment that's available in this program if you're willing to look at this through an ecosystem lens and use some of the techniques that we will continue to develop in this course.